Welcome back to another episode of An Unexpected Fight with myself, Tiffany, and Kelly. We have a super special guest today that I'm really excited about. And just to tell you a little bit about him, we have Dr. Richard Gaster, who is a managing partner at venBio with experience as a physician, entrepreneur, and life science investor. He has helped to launch, invest, and serve on the board or as a board observer of many venBio companies. Prior to joining venBio, Dr. Gaster served as the head of translational medicine at Pliant Therapeutics. As a key member of the founding management team, Dr. Gaster was instrumental in the formation and launch of the Pliant Therapeutics from Third Rock Ventures, where he previously served as a senior associate. Dr. Gaster has published numerous articles in top-tier peer-reviewed journals, including Nature Medicine and Nature Nanotechnology, and holds more than a dozen patents. Was awarded his first prize in the IEEE Change the World competition and was named one of the Forbes 30 Under 30 in Science and Healthcare. Dr. Gaster holds a BSc in bioengineering from the University of Pennsylvania, where he graduated summa cum laude and was a university scholar. He received his MD and Ph.D. in bioengineering from Stanford University in the medical science training program. We are so excited to have you today. And what a bio that is.
Thank you for having me.
Very impressive. So I'm going to start us off with our first question I have for you. Your work in biotech and investment has focused on life sciences. Can you share if there was a personal experience or maybe an inspiration that led you to this path?
Yeah, so thank you for having me, first of all, and I appreciate the sharing stories for patients and families in need. But yeah, so actually growing up, I always wanted to be a physician. Come from a family of physicians. My grandfather was a surgeon. My dad is a surgeon. My plan was to be a surgeon. And so started out initially in goals of being a physician, but then realized I liked research and drug development as well. And so instead of just going kind of straight MD path, did MD PhD so I could kind of explore both medicine and science. Ultimately trained in plastic and reconstructive surgery, but then transitioned from medicine to basic science research, initially starting a therapeutics company going after a disease called idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. It's not cancer, but it's as deadly as cancer. So after diagnosis, you have about a 4-year average survival. And went in, built and launched this company, and then didn't go back to medicine and decided instead of building one company at a time, I could back multiple companies in parallel as an investor. And so then went into venture capital, specifically focused on drug development.
That's so cool. I love that. It's for those of you who don't know, I'm a nurse practitioner who worked in oncology for 14 years and recently ventured into industry with one of the diagnostic companies for cancer. And being on both sides of medicine is something you just truly can't appreciate or understand until you've done it, what it takes to do some of this research, the capital it takes to do the research, and to be able to get these therapeutic agents from idea to patient ready is so long and costs so much money. And I just don't think people really can appreciate how much work is involved in that, from the researchers to all of the people that are involved in making all of that happen. So, yeah, I mean, hats off to you. That's
you're exactly right. A lot of people look at a pill and say, this small molecule pill costs 35 cents to make. And like, why are drugs so expensive? But to get, and which is true, to actually make that pill can be very cheap. But to get that drug through preclinical development, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and ultimate approval typically costs over $1 billion. And so if you're not able to reimburse that research cost, no drugs will ever be developed. But that's the whole purpose of having a term on patent life. So, typically these patents last, depends, there's been changes more recently, but 9 to 14 years. And after you're paying a premium, then it should become generic, and then it's cheap for everybody. So it's a way to reward the investors that have taken the risk and have a treatment that lasts forever for patients.
Cool. I met you in Mexico at our ETMR ATRT conference and got to hear your story about your daughter Claire, who was diagnosed with a pediatric brain tumor. How has that shaped like your perspective on research and patient advocacy and what you do?
Yeah, having the personal experience is incredibly informative. I think one of the biggest challenges that you realize when you have a patient, a kid with this diagnosis is rare diseases are incredibly challenging to navigate because you don't have the wealth of clinical data with a rare disease. So on the one hand, you don't have information in which to base your treatment and protocols. And on the other hand, because it's a rare disease, industry doesn't support clinical development in the same level that they do for more common diseases. And so it's definitely shining a light on this sort of unmet space of, taking the efforts to really characterize and study these rare diseases, and most importantly, sharing of information across institutions. And so, like right now, if you're looking at a blood pressure medicine, you could run a 10,000 patient study and know exactly what the efficacy is and what the safety is, and so on. With a rare disease, no one's publishing a 10,000 patient study because there's 50 kids a year that have it. But if you look at every institution across the world, if they're able to share information and combine in more anecdotal cases rather than a big study, you could start to come to consensus. And so, like the conference that you alluded to, this ATRT conference and ETMR conference, was incredibly valuable because we had people from all over the world come together and talk about their experiences, which wouldn't warrant a formal clinical trial or publication, but allows for sort of some group thought and consensus.
Absolutely.
It's really cool.
That, I think, yeah.
I like the way you explain that because I get that question a lot. Why is certain pediatric cancers so underfunded and why are we so behind in the development of drugs? And like you said, it's not, it's a numbers thing when you look at it. It's hard for companies to get on board when we're talking about, to me, 43 kids a day diagnosed with cancer is a lot, but then you break that down and it's thousands of different pediatric cancers. So you've got 10 kids with a brain tumor that day and, maybe 20 with different leukemias. And it's hard to get companies on board, I think, for development standpoint for that. But so very necessary for these kiddos to give them a chance. So tell us a little bit more about Claire and her journey.
Yes. So Claire was diagnosed exactly a year ago. So March 1st, last year. She was a little over 2 at the time and was doing fine and had a seizure out of the blue. So we rushed her to the emergency room. We got a CT of the brain. The CT was interesting. It actually was very subtle. There was like a very subtle finding, and they consulted the pediatric neurologist at the time. And we were at a satellite hospital of Stanford's, but so she was at Stanford, we were at the satellite hospital. So she looked at the scans and called in, and she was an epilepsy expert. And she's like, "Oh, your daughter most likely has epilepsy. Follow up in my outpatient epilepsy clinic. We can get you in the next 2 to 3 months." And so I was like, this is pretty atypical for like a healthy 2-year-old, totally out of the blue, to be newly diagnosed with epilepsy. I was like, pushed really hard to be admitted and get an MRI of the brain so we could actually see what's going on before being, thrown back out. So they agreed, but they said the MRI is not urgent. So, shoulder MRIs that were scheduled I'm exaggerating. I don't know who got priority, but so we were in the hospital for 3 days. Every day she was kept NPO, so she couldn't eat, just waiting, hoping that an MRI slot would open up. Crying, saying, "I'm so hungry." As a 2-year-old, you can't explain why you're like starving them every day. And then finally on the 3rd day, a slot opened up and the image came back showing a highly aggressive features of brain cancer. And what's pretty impressive, actually, the radiologist said, this looks like ATRT. And it's a rare tumor type. So to be able to sort of pseudo predict that was interesting. I never heard of ATRT, and immediately looked it up, and obviously like, broke down when I, heard about it. The neurosurgery team put us on the schedule for the next day, which was very nice. So she got the tumor removed the next day. It was a gross total resection. The surgeon was like, margins looked clean. And then we were faced with, how do we treat this? And there's all these different protocols. UCSF had a protocol. Dana-Farber had a protocol. There are protocols out of Europe that were different. And so spent the next like 5 days reaching out to and calling like every expert I could find. And like the key question, so there are 3 features to the treatment. One is chemo in the brain, like intrathecal chemo. The other is systemic chemo, and the third is radiation. And out of the systemic chemo, there's like this stem cell transplant component where you do like super high dose chemo requiring a stem cell rescue. And so each doc I would talk to, like, what's most important? Brain chemo, stem cell transplants, or radiation? And everyone gave a different answer. And when you get a different answer from everyone, like one doc was like, I am adamant, like radiation is the most important thing. Everything else is less relevant. And, so when you get that as an answer, as a parent and as a like researcher, like clearly nobody knows what's going on. And it's not because people aren't trying and they don't care. It's just because it's so rare. And, we don't have like formal studies in the way, as we alluded to, the like larger indications have. And so kind of came up with a protocol that combines everything. This is an aggressive tumor. We wanted to throw everything at this that we could. So we did high dose intrathecal chemo. I used some like of my companies to model out the pharmacokinetics to make sure it's not toxic. We did 3 stem cell transplants, and then we did proton beam radiation at MGH. So in that journey, I think we were in the hospital for over 100 nights. It was about 8 months. The proton beam radiation was 6 weeks of daily radiation requiring daily anesthesia. But she completed all treatments in October of last year. And right now she's disease-free, has no deficits, is, other than her short hair, which is growing back, she's 100% back to normal. Like you'd have no idea what she went through. We actually literally yesterday just took out her port because they felt like she's doing so well. So
I remember that that step in the journey. It's a big milestone, and I'm so happy for you. My story, I feel like I resonate with you a lot because we have a lot of similarities in our story and our journey and how we found the tumor. And she's very, very lucky to have you. And you brought up a really good point that I think comes up in every podcast, but advocacy, being able to advocate and ask the right questions. It's so very important because, these providers really are in it for the right reasons, but some of these tumors are so rare. So you may have someone giving you one answer and someone giving you another. And I think, getting a second and third opinion is very, very important when we're talking about rare tumors. So thank you for sharing your story with us. And I'm so happy to hear how awesome she's doing. She's a little fighter.
Yeah, she is such a fighter. And actually, like, I would break down and she would like hold my hand and she'd be like,
oh, sweet
like,
baby.
Here's my favorite stuffed animal. It'll make you feel better,
It's awesome.
Yep.
So they're so strong, like these kids who are going through hell, they are so strong. It's incredible to see. So how do you balance emotional and scientific aspects of working in this field that impacts families on such a deep level? Like, as you know, like all of us who have been impacted by lack of treatment. So like you have all of these great things that you're working on, and that's just amazing to see. So how do you work through that?
Yeah. It's a tough question. The emotional side, I think, drives the scientific side, but like for me, my outlet is like digging into the science. And so like, in this case, you can somewhat feel helpless because you're at the whim. And so like what I tried to do is literally read every single paper and talk to every single KOL. And then once we had a treatment plan, I literally mapped out every day, every injection, And if things got off course, which they do, you realign all your my spreadsheets and timelines and so on. So I guess balancing I use the science to help with the emotional side, but then taking a step back, like from a career perspective, um, the ultimate motivation of like what we do is to develop treatments for patients that have unmet medical needs. And we try to focus on either first in class treatments or best in class treatments. And we don't do any me toos. Like a simple follow on is not interesting, because you're basically making an incremental change on patient lives versus a step function change.
So you've been instrumental in launching and investing in biotech companies. Now I'm going to name them, and I apologize if I get any names wrong, but you got Akero, is it, Therapeutics,
Yeah.
Harmony Biosciences, and Ventyx Biosciences.
Mm-hmm.
Can you share how these companies are contributing to the advancement of medicine?
Sure. So that's like a subset of some of the companies that we've been involved in building. So Harmony Biosciences is an exciting one because this is a company that has an FDA approved drug for the treatment of a rare disease called narcolepsy, where patients, they have an emotional sensation and they'll just fall asleep. And it's incredibly dangerous. If you're like walking, you could just hit the ground, or driving. And so having a safe, effective FDA approved drug that treats a rare disease is pretty rewarding. Akero has a treatment for a relatively common a consequence of obesity, so fatty liver disease that results in liver fibrosis. And they more recently read out what we believe is the best in class efficacy data for patients that have late stage fibrosis of the liver that typically results in end stage liver disease and require transplantation. And then Ventyx has been focusing on sort of the inflammation space that has many different applications, both broad and narrow. So, but yeah, I mean, more broadly, like our portfolio covers oncology, immunology, rare genetic diseases. We, in terms of modalities, we'll develop small molecules, biologics, cell therapies, and so tend to try to focus on the science and the unmet need. And high level, I think we have 7 FDA approved drugs for 11 different indications.
Oh, that's cool.
You do it all.
So like as a venture capitalist, I'm actually able to treat more patients than I would as a physician, taking care of one patient at a time.
I love it. So first, this is kind of a two-part question. So tell us about what translational medicine is, and then you use this at Pliant Therapeutics. So how do you see the role of drug discovery evolving within this?
Yeah, so translational medicine and so that was my first role after leaving, medicine. So translational medicine is really where you have one foot on the preclinical side and one foot on the clinical side, and the key is to come up with, animal models of disease and test the drugs in these various animal models and use those animal experiments for like key go, no go decisions to take assets into the clinic. And so, by having the MD as the clinical side and the PhD on the sort of research side, it enabled me to kind of straddle the two and help as we kind of pick out which drugs, because typically what you do in drug development campaign is you make tons of molecules and survival of the fittest effectively, and finally just advance the best one into humans.
And then how do you see this, kind of evolving in like more rare diseases? Let's say pediatric cancer.
Yeah. So actually at our ATRT conference, there was some great preclinical research coming out of some of the academic labs that was presented. And so what we do is we scour the academic literature. And so typically the initial ideas come out of academia or out of pharma. And we will look at some level of evidence that they've published on, and then take that target that's been identified or that molecule that they've made to that target and turn sort of what starts out as a science project into a drug. And so, as it relates to pediatric cancer, even in ATRT, for example, there's some nice genetics that people can utilize to then develop drugs to have a more targeted approach. It's just the biggest challenge is getting the funding to do it. There was a small biotech company that had developed a treatment for ATRT that was then acquired by a larger company, and then they shut down the rare pediatric brain cancer efforts because they don't have the market. And so there's some unfortunate realities that extend beyond sort of the initial drug development phase that creates pressure.
With your background in bioengineering and medicine, what are some of the most exciting emerging technologies that could be revolutionizing different treatment or maybe some pediatric cancer treatment?
Yeah, so I think the merger of human genetics and a lot of chemotherapy right now is focused on a big sledgehammer that kills all cells, but the tumor cells faster than the healthy cells, and there's significant toxicities. And so with bioengineering, you can engineer little organoids, these like little examples of human disease, and test molecules that are more precise that enable you to hurt the cancer cells without hurting the healthy cells. And so there's this concept in drug development of therapeutic index. The wider the therapeutic index, the more room you have between cancer cell killing and healthy cell killing. And so the ultimate goal would be to have an index that's so large that you're only killing cancer cells and you're not impacting healthy cells at all. And again, some of the science that was presented at this conference that we went to shed some nice light on widening the therapeutic index. I think, though, taking a step back, the biggest challenge we face in treatment evolution in pediatric cancers is right now morbidity and mortality is high for these diseases, and there's a quote standard of care of these massive sledgehammers, and if you take off one of the sledgehammers and it's your kid or your patient and they don't do well, you regret it. And so the biggest challenge to our industry or the pediatric brain cancer treatments, and I don't actually know a solution, is the ability to peel back these super toxic regimens and still have confidence that you're going to get efficacy.
Right. It's hard to enroll families in trials for that same reason. I research trials for families on a regular, and families are smart, and even if they don't have a medical background, they start asking, is this phase 1? Is this phase 2? What do you know about it? What data do you have? And those are hard questions because, quite frankly, the answer is we don't have a lot of data on it yet. But the previous treatments we know are not working. Some of these children, like Dr. Gaster and I's daughter, we were lucky and they pulled through, but we've lost so many friends along the way with the same type of tumors. And quite frankly, the 95% risk of developing side effects as they grow in their adulthood, it's awful. So, but you're right. That's difficult, and it's a difficult conversation for families. And as a cancer mom, I'm torn because I love science, but I also understand why you want to go with these heavy hitters that might destroy the cell. And at least there's some research that they destroy the cancer cells. But
yeah, I mean, we had this conversation with the chemo selection, which is, this one agent is very effective, and there's a good chance it's going to make your daughter infertile. And so then you're like, oh, I have to make this decision. And then you think to yourself, and before there's responses, you don't know what the survival is. And it's like, I hope that's a problem that I face, that they're, right. But then you get there and then you're like, then you wonder. So anyway, it's just, As a parent, it becomes very challenging because there's consequences even to the standard of care treatments. But then right back to the question around, you know, like, how do you peel back and go forward with more safe approaches? I think of the treatment paradigm in two buckets. One is sort of first line. So like a newly diagnosed patient, there, I think it's even harder to peel back.
Right.
And then there's relapsed refractory. It comes back, and there's so many options, and even fewer. Uh, uh, you know, there's even less data about each. And there's up and coming great research with like cell therapies, CAR T approaches that are targeted to the tumor type, highly effective. Also have extensive conditioning regimens, et cetera. But anyway, the first line is sort of what I was alluding to rather than the second line, but both are challenging.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So there's obviously a lot of challenges in this industry, especially in, pediatric cancer with funding and developing therapies. How do you think the biotech industry is like helping overcome some of these challenges?
Yeah, so there are a good number of companies focused on rare diseases. The majority are not, frankly, but there are a good number. And there's one specifically that they were at the conference as well. Day One has like a specific focus on pediatric brain cancers, which is incredibly nice to have. But to broaden that focus, I think part of it requires some commercial success with these rare diseases, and that helps foster it. There's also certain areas of you can get things like priority review vouchers. So if you have a rare disease that gets FDA approved, you can sell these vouchers for 150 million dollars. And so anyway, there are mechanisms in place to encourage and support development in rare diseses.
Just 100 to 150 million. Just
Did you see my eyes lit up? I was like, wow, okay. I mean, I knew about the vouchers, but I didn't know they went for that much.
He said 150 million.
So I'm going to put you on the spot with this one because we already talked about how this is a hard one to overcome here, but you've worked on a lot of early stage drug development. Do you have any ideas on how we can accelerate clinical trials for pediatric cancer patients to ensure, more targeted, less toxic therapies? I know it's a hard one because it's that balance, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think what would be the most valuable, maybe this isn't practical, but what would be the most valuable, and this isn't just for rare pediatric brain cancer, but rare diseases more broadly, is to have a centralized database of all the patients that everybody shares information. And the challenge is, whoever is aggregating that data, whoever the lead person is, has an interest in publishing, and that publication allows them to get promoted. And so there's this current sentiment where this is my data, and I don't want anyone else to see my data, because it's when I have my big reveal on my exciting data package, that's going to get everyone to read it and click on it. And the score of, there's this thing called an H impact of how impactful your research is. If you share your information with everyone, your research isn't impactful when the publication comes out. But if there's a way to incentivize sharing of every like you have a diagnosis and every patient's information goes in there, the treatments, the results, every nuance, that I think would be the most helpful. And so, like, for example, at this conference we went to, there was a physician in Vienna that presented some data in relapsed patients, and her data looked fantastic. And it was incredibly impressive. Something, I'm not an expert in the space, but read a ton, something that I hadn't popped up on my radar in the past. But so if you have this sort of centralized system, people can see the results of everybody else in real time, rather than, there was one KOL I spoke to, and this person was like, I have 25 patients that have done this regimen and I haven't published it yet. And, showed me some of the results. And was like, if the world knew this in real time, and you have your 26th patient, now you've updated it, people can learn faster, and you can look at both efficacy and safety. And so pick the ones that give you that that therapeutic index and efficacy you're looking for. So I think that would probably be the most valuable, and probably has to be driven by not by an academic institution, but by a nonprofit.
Yep. I've been
Well,
saying
I'll
for
start
years.
it. I mean,
Yeah.
just give me the data and I'll make sure this happens. No, like seriously, one thing that I have found, so working in adult oncology, I've watched this transition over the last decade of NGS testing and drug development based on findings from so many NGS tests being done. And we used to just test for EGFR and ALK and ROS1, and now we've got these whole exome, whole transcriptome, 17 panel IHC tests to be able to target and make precision treatments for the specific patient, for that specific cancer type. And like all these drugs were developed on the back end of doing all these tests. And so my question has always been, why are we not testing pediatric cancer patients when they're diagnosed with these NGS tests to find what do we need to target here? And so I've been on a soapbox about that since Nora got diagnosed, I think. But it's the same type of thing. Like, put their NGS results in there, put their treatment results, put what you're giving them, how they tolerate, just all these things in a database, because there's not enough patients to not share.
Yeah,
Right.
totally agreed. And actually on that front, I completely agree that having everyone get sequenced is incredibly informative. And when Claire was diagnosed, we actually reached out to a couple of these NGS companies specifically around, and a lot of them I didn't even get a reply. So it was tough. But on the flip side, outside of pediatric brain cancer, on the sequencing side, the companies have, as you alluded to, have the ability to do whole exome genome sequencing, and like you could literally know what their risk factors are. That they might get Huntington's in the future or something. But if a cardiologist, for example, wants to order a test to look at risk factors for cardiovascular disease, it's just as easy to look for everything. But the cardiologist doesn't want to have to counsel their patients if something pops up that's not cardiology related. And so then again, the physician's driving this narrow focus to their area because it's convenient rather than what's in the best interest of the patient.
I'm seeing it more and more become more of a standard of care, but we still do have some pediatric oncologists who are not big on ordering NGS testing. What are your thoughts on the reason behind that? Is it cost? Is it just the fact that because it's still, let's say, new, even if something pops up, we might not have a drug to target that yet, and therefore they don't see the,
I think the biggest concern that they face is you can find a lot of mutations that are actually not active mutations. They could be completely like the protein that's made could be just as active even if there's a mutation, and so you could end up getting effectively false positives. That being said, I'd rather have the information, know that that's a liability, and figure out what to do as a result of it, rather than just close your eyes and not want to look more broadly. So like we ultimately did it with Claire, and a couple of things popped up here or there beyond just like INI negative, which is a ATRT or SMARCB1 mutation, but then you can actually use specific algorithms to predict if any changes are pathologic or not, and then they can, with not 100% certainty but decently high confidence, give you reassurance. So all this to say, there are ways to get comfortable with mitigating that concern.
Yeah. Well, and Tiffany and I think argued with somebody one time about the, need for testing. So we're like, yeah, right now, maybe you won't find something that stands out to you. But in 5-10 years, if we test enough kids
Exactly.
and this data gets input, we're going to start seeing trends. So if you're listening to this, order NGS testing on your patients, please.
Please, all the patients.
And share it with passion, but share it so that everyone, because that's the other thing. There might be certain there's things called genetic modifiers where you might have another mutation that might make you more prone to respond to therapy or less prone to respond to therapy. And so if you know the broader profile of the patient and this patient has a phenomenal response, or zero response whatsoever.
Right.
If more patients are uploading information, you could start to see that, oh, this is a potential genetic modifier of the disease, and maybe you give one drug or another, or not, as a
Right.
result.
So you talked about, going from like these animal preclinical trials to getting those over to human trials. So tell us how the process of transforming those discoveries into viable treatment options happens.
Yeah. So in general, this is a overly simplistic description, but in general, let's say in cancer, for example, academics will have what are called xenograft models. They'll take a tumor from a human, put it in a mouse, and see that it grows. And then they'll test different drugs to try to treat those tumors in these rodents. And typically the drugs they pick are based on some type of scientific discovery, like a genetic target, or other drugs in development seem viable. So anyway, they look for responses. After that, they'll typically then do a whole battery of tests just in cells, so not in animals, and they'll look to see, how is it broken down? Does it have any, does it interact with DNA? Could it be carcinogenic for X number of reasons? And then they do what's called a selectivity screen. So they look to see if it binds, several hundred other targets. After it passes that whole battery of tests, then you go into a larger species, just to make sure that the drug is safe and tolerable. So you'll run toxicity studies, typically in two different species, a rodent and something larger. And then you kind of estimate what the exposure is in these animals, what the drug levels are in these animals relative to what the effective dose was in your efficacy rodent models. And from there, you try to pick a starting dose in a human. So if it passes all these tests, it works in the animals, it's safe in the animals, then you typically start, there's a range, but tenfold, let's say, lower than the effective dose. And you go into, depending on the disease, you'll either go straight into patients or you'll go into healthy volunteers, and you'll slowly dose escalate until you get to levels that you think are efficacious. So that would be like a phase 1 clinical trial. Phase 1 just looks for sort of safety and exposure of the drug. Then you'll run phase 2, and a phase 2 tends to be efficacy, but not in very large number of patients. So it sort of spot checks, like, is this active? Are there any hints of a safety signal? And if not, then you'll run what's called a phase 3, which is the approval study, where you test it in a lot more patients for a lot longer. And on the back of that, you then present to the FDA a data package that says this drug at these levels has this activity. You have to typically have a benchmark. And so you'll compare to whatever the standard of care is. And if you have better efficacy or better tolerability or better safety or all of the above, then you have grounds for approval. But that process can take over 10 years.
Yep. I'm glad you explained that, because I think there's a lot of people out there who don't. I mean, I won't admit, I don't fully understand it myself, but there's a lot of people who have no idea what goes into it and how it's developed. And they question, why would I invest in this, or why would I do this when it's been 10 years and we haven't come, it's just, there's so much more that goes into it, I think, than people ultimately realize. So thank you for giving that explanation.
Yep.
So you've obviously been up through this on both sides of things, just like both Tiffany and I. What advice do you have for families navigating a pediatric cancer diagnosis, especially those that may be considering clinical trials or these new kind of emerging treatments?
Yeah, so I think for me, at least, what was most helpful was to chat with as many people as I could, both the physicians and family members. What I would say is actually the physicians were helpful to talk about the data, and the family members were really helpful to talk about how to navigate the day-to-day of dealing with the treatments and the side effects associated with it. There were so many aspects to managing Claire's care beyond the drugs themselves that weren't really explained to us as we chat with the physicians, but were highlighted in extreme detail from families. And so like one specific example is for the stem cell transplants, we do carboplatin thiotepa. When you do thiotepa, you have to do baths where you scrub off the skin. Not this, you don't fillet them, but you give them a bath every 4 to 6 hours for 2 days straight. Middle of the night, you wake them up, you put them in a bath, you scrub them down, because the drug itself leaves the body through the skin and you get a horrible rash, like a burn, if it doesn't stay there. They never even told us about that. And so, we're going in, but then all these families are like, oh my gosh, the thiotepa baths are like really emotionally draining, and he gave all sorts of advice, of how to navigate it. So I give that anecdote because, like, to a physician, that's not like a toxicity that you're worried about. They talk about impact of fertility or peripheral neuropathy or hearing loss, things that are monitorable and they care about, long term, and probably are documented in a clinical trial. But for us, like, the thiotepa baths were like incredibly traumatizing, and having, advice how to manage that was very helpful. So anyway, chat with everyone you can. And what I would say is, at first, it's emotional to chat with people about it, and it's hard. But at the end of the day, at least for us, the more we knew, the more we felt like we could get our arms around it.
Absolutely. In my role, that's one of the things I try to do, is connect families with other families of the same diagnosis, because it was really nice for me. Although also, like you said, difficult. Connecting with other glioblastoma families is rough because a lot of them lose their children to it, and hearing that is hard. Mm-hmm. But I will say there was a lot of things other families told me to expect, that, doctors do have the best interest in mind, but they've got big fish to fry, and that's what they're focused on. And so sometimes, like, the baths might not cross their mind right off the bat. So that's really great advice.
Yeah, I love that. I always try, whenever I see new cancer families come across my social media feed. Somebody sent me this beautiful written letter to a new cancer parent, and I always send that same letter to people. That it's just such a sentiment of, like, how hard it is to hear those words, and like take time for yourself. You're going to feel bad. People are going to say stupid things to you. Just like have grace and take some time for yourself, and remember, like, this will end. You just have to hold on for a little bit. So yeah, it can be so tough. Yeah. So what do you feel like the role for investors and biotech companies play in ensuring pediatric cancer research, and that it kind of remains a priority in the medical field? I know for you, probably it does more than, others, which is why I ask you.
Yeah, I think there's a subset of investors that really do care about rare diseases. The unfortunate reality is a lot of people don't. At the end of the day, investors do have their investors that, are giving them money to make them money. In general, in our industry, like, we can actually make money by doing well for the world. Like, if I get a drug approved, we're going to make money for our shareholders. But I think it is important to have a focus on rare diseases, and there are investors that care, as you can see from a subset. I think a way to help, which is I alluded to, are things like that priority review voucher to encourage pediatric research, and then more broadly, again, bundling patients into these larger sort of aggregated databases is incredibly helpful. That's helpful, as I alluded to, in terms of understanding outcomes, but it can also be, and Kelly, you or both of you guys can attest to this, which is in clinical trials, if you have the ability to find the patients, that's a barrier. If you lower that barrier, that makes you more likely to want to invest. One of the things investors do fear, for a good reason, in rare diseases is, like, how am I going to find these patients? How long is it going to take me to enroll, 30 patients? If it's going to take me 10 years to enroll 30 patients, that's not interesting for me. And if I need 30 patients for approval, there's no path forward. But if there's a registry and you're like, hey, look, these are all the patients around the world, and like these people meet your inclusion exclusion criteria, now you've got the motivation that if you build the drug, you can run the study.
Absolutely. Well, next year, I'm going to send you an invite to NPCF Research Consortium, because that is something that sets us apart. And Tiffany can attest because she attended not this year, but last. It's doctors from all across the country that come together. I do think that there is a lot of pediatric oncologists that want to share research because they realize they can't do this alone. They're not going to get the numbers that they need for the data that they need. So we have a group of 120 plus across the country that do openly share their research.
That's wonderful.
But I think the next step, like you said, would be that centralized database. And I've been saying it since my daughter was diagnosed. I think I actually asked, is there not a centralized database? And my oncologist laughed at me. He goes, no, Kelly, there's not. And I'm like, there needs to be. He goes, I agree with you. And, maybe one day. I still have hope.
Yes.
Well, thank you so, so much. How can the public and advocacy groups better support the development of innovative therapies?
I guess, so on the advocacy side, I'm actually not that familiar. I'm not sure, but I guess the bigger the voice, the better. But as it relates more broadly, I do think that, getting traditional venture capital money into building these rare disease plays is challenging. And so having a pot of capital from, donors that want to help and ensure drug development could be helpful. And so I know that there are various research awards that the institutions have to help support it, which is helpful. But obviously, the more capital you can put to work there, the better. And I don't want to get into politics, but as if funding from the government is reduced, which it has been, then there is a little bit even more pressure to have some of the patient advocacy groups raise capital to help supplement drug development for rare disease.
Yeah, absolutely. Now more than ever, we need people to kind of step up.
So if you could change one thing about pediatric cancer research or treatment, what would that one thing be?
I think I'm going to go back to the theme of this centralized registry. I really strongly believe that having a single database with every patient diagnosed around the world sounds like a dream, would be very helpful. I think one of the challenges too is at different places, well, there's going to be translation barriers. So because, medical records are written in different languages, et cetera. Hopefully with AI, you could just quickly fix that goal. But then the other issue is data entry. So the input of data is different and the way people ask questions is different. And so there are technical challenges that requires, I think, detailed auditing of data to make sure that the integrity is there. But for example, if the database has the date of relapse of a tumor, what is the date of relapse? Is the date of relapse the date that the patient had a symptom? Is it the date that the patient had an image to confirm that something is there? Did they have a blood test that showed some biomarker was elevated? There are certain terms that you might initially think of as universal, but if they're not universal, need to be, you have to pick something and go with it across the board. So anyway, there are challenges for sure, many publishing challenges, ownership of data challenges, leak of patient information, et cetera. But if we could do that, I think that would be incredibly helpful. And for all rare diseases, not just pediatric brain cancer.
So if any software developer, web design person is listening to this podcast, reach out to us so we can help you.
You want your next AI machine learning application.
We have your next idea. Just give our foundations a little bit of the profits and go ahead and get that set up for us. That'll be really great.
All right. What are you most hopeful about when it comes to the future of medicine, especially for children battling serious diseases?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there are some very promising precision medicine approaches out there where instead of using this big, hammer chemotherapy approach, you could get really surgical and identify the specific genetic underlying defect and correct that defect, whether that's, through a small molecule drug like a kinase inhibitor to inhibit like a enzyme active, a aberrant enzyme that's active, or, a cell therapy where you're putting in cells that target the specific tumor antigen, like the protein on the surface of the tumor, and kill it kind of with your own cells, or gene editing or gene therapy. There's a number of very exciting approaches that will hopefully enable a more precision approach rather than this sort of sledgehammer approach that we're doing right now.
Well, I definitely agree and think that you have done an amazing job at explaining all of this and how it can tie into research and pediatric cancer. We're so thankful that you decided to join us and share Claire's story today. And if you want to get involved, donate, please reach out to us. Our links are in the show notes, and we look forward to seeing you next time on An Unexpected Fight.